Dr. Mamphela and Dr. Jim Doty. I think I'll use this time a little bit to talk briefly about the Global Compassion Coalition. The central idea is rooted in our own history as human beings who have been living together as anatomically modern human beings for a really long time, 300,000 years, resting on another roughly 2 million years before that as tool manufacturing hominids with a gradually growing, increasingly social brain, as the brain has roughly tripled in volume over the last 3 million years. Down almost all of that long journey, it became increasingly important that we live on the basis of what's called caring and sharing, which could be said to be compassion and justice at the foundation of daily life. That's our nature. That's our home base. Until roughly 10,000 years ago, when agriculture was developed with its advantages, still in larger populations and surpluses, enabling concentrations of wealth and power that then accelerated over time, making the world kind of like Game of Thrones for a lot of people for a long time, and moved away from that foundation of compassion and justice, caring and sharing, to the more kind of primitive, standard primate strategy of holding and controlling our alpha dominance. That's a bit of a scientific and scholarly explanation for the deep roots of the trouble we find ourselves in today, all 8 billion of us trying to live together in sustainable peace and prosperity on an increasingly overheated, fragile planet Earth. So what do we do about it? And it seemed to me that we need to take a page out of what worked so well for most of the time. Humanity and our immediate ancestors has walked this earth, which is to reestablish compassion and justice at the foundation of public life, societies, in other words, in our politics, in our governments, in our institutions, in our communities, and in the ways in which nations deal with each other. Compassion and justice. How do you actually do that? The only possible way to do it, I think, and the only way it ever gets done, is to form effective coalitions at a scale that is big enough to be strong enough to make the world we long for. Not just write manifestos, not just write beautiful, aspirational, and important statements, not just do the talk. We need to turn that talk into a walk. And what turns that talk into a walk, as it happened in my country in the 60s and 70s in major movements, as Ramphele here, as an historic figure in South Africa, was a leader in that process herself. She's seen it from the inside herself, and we're going to hear more about that. We've seen again and again that what makes it work is to form these effective coalitions that can make real change happen. And so that's the foundation of the Global Compassion Coalition. That's our long-term view. Short-term view is to be a global hub of resources for the experiences and the expressions of compassion, absolutely foundational. But long-term, we're really interested in how can humanity come together at scale. The great, vast majority of people who really do want to live in peace with each other, who really do want to live on the basis of compassion and justice. That's definitely where we're going. So you're helping us do that by participating here, by telling other people about the coalition, by, if you've got it to spare, donating financially. That helps us keep the lights on and, offer programs like this. And so I just really want to finish by speaking from my heart, additionally, because I've been speaking from my heart already, and really thank you for being here. So I still think Dr. Doty is held up and no longer held up. All right. Jim is in the house. So you're muted, I think, over there. Great.
I was here. You just ignored me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So sorry. I didn't realize you had come in. I'm so glad.
Rick, I'm used to it by now. It's okay.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about childhood here. So thank you. Well, that's great. So with that as a wonderful transition, I'll just offer a very brief introduction. I'll maybe start with you. So Jim is a friend, ally, a benefactor, neurosurgeon, has had quite an extraordinary life. We're going to talk some about the lessons really in your own personal journey here. His book, Into the Magic Shop, is an incredible book. And I kind of live in the world of good books for people. And your book there, Jim, is really magnificent. It's a masterpiece. It's no wonder it's going to be made into a movie. It's no wonder that this fantastic K-pop band from South Korea has turned one of the aspects of it into an anthem. And you're, of course, along the way, someone who's been a major figure in the movement of compassion and the foregrounding of it on this planet, including founding, with the Dalai Lama's support, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education there at Stanford University. I'm sure I've left out a number of really important things about your life story here, but I'll maybe finish with that. And then I'd like to introduce Mamphela, and then I'll come back to you, Jim, with kind of my opening question, if that's okay. And I can tell people in general that feel free to make comments and offer questions in the chat. We won't be able to talk with people individually here, but I'll definitely try to pick up on some of your comments and questions and offer them to our speakers here. So the other person next to me here, also my friend and benefactor, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, who is trained as a physician. She has also been an activist in the struggle against apartheid and its consequences, which is an ongoing struggle in South Africa. She has an entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I thought was pretty cool when I first discovered that. She's now, I believe, co-president of the Club of Rome. She's been a director of the World Bank. She's been very involved in major non-governmental organizations on the global stage for many decades. And in her own journey, she's really lived through the hard times and is able to talk about it. So I know I've left out, again, many important details, but let's get into it, okay? So I wanted to start by getting personal. This is about a heart-centered life. And having a heart-centered life, maintaining a heart-centered life in an unheartful world, often. And so, Jim, I wondered if we could begin. I thought I'd maybe take about 5 minutes for each of you to, if you could, talk about your own background as a child, your own journey through your youth into adulthood, and some of the challenges you faced, and kind of the roots of your own journey with compassion and toward compassion, including finding compassion sometimes for others who were challenging, and finding compassion for yourself along the way. So I'm kind of setting it up here, and now, can you help us understand your own journey? Oops. Mission Control, we're having technical problems.
Exactly. Well, it's wonderful to be with the both of you, and thank you so much for having me. And these topics we're discussing are critical, and not only on an individual level, I think, but a global level. And I appreciate you asking about my own background. And the reality is, each of us has a story, and oftentimes they're extraordinary stories. And in fact, they're stories that result in us carrying baggage with us, whether that's for the good or the bad. And in my situation as a child, some of you may know this who are listening, my father was an alcoholic. And my mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, and unfortunately went into a deep depression and attempted suicide multiple times. We were on public assistance. We were evicted from different residences. And obviously, this is not the type of childhood anyone would wish to have. That being said, though, certainly I know, and maybe even with some of the listeners, it's even been worse for you. In my case, that situation left me filled with hopelessness and despair, and a feeling that I had no access, my voice was not heard, no one cared. And when you get into this framework in your mind, it only exacerbates the situation. And in fact, what happens is you start carrying this baggage with you, and it impacts every action and everything that you do. So, what happened to me that allowed me to, if you will, overcome that? And an interesting thing happened when I was 12. I walked into a magic shop. And the interesting part of it wasn't just walking into a magic shop, but it was when I entered, there was a woman there who, and I think probably all of you have experienced meeting someone who whose smile embraces you, who you can tell immediately that they're non-judgmental, they accept you for who you are, they recognize your dignity. And in that situation, it creates an environment of psychological safety. And this is something that all of us want, all of us crave, all of us need, this ability to be who we are, to be accepted, to have our dignity respected. And this was how I felt with this woman. And we began a conversation. And it turned out she was the owner's mother, that he was actually running an errand. And she informed me when I asked her some questions that she knew nothing about magic, but she did know about people. And after a conversation of about 15 or 20 minutes, she said to me, I really like you. I'm going to be here for 6 weeks. If you come every day, I think I could teach you something that could help you. And I did. And what she showed me was ultimately one, that I actually was in a constant state of chaos and trauma because of my home situation. And when you're in that situation, it's very difficult to concentrate. It's very difficult to focus. And so she taught me a mindfulness exercise, first with relaxing the body, and then an understanding that the negative thoughts in my head were actually not from me, but they were created, and that they, as a result, did not represent necessarily who I was at all, and that I didn't have to listen to them, and that ultimately I could change them from one of negativity to one of positivity. And that's when everything changed. I was able to give myself self-compassion. I was able to see the world through a different lens, understanding that everyone was suffering. And ultimately, she also included exercises, in fact, how to manifest my intention. And I had always wanted to be a doctor. And from that simple interaction, and maybe it wasn't so simple at the end of the day, but it changed the trajectory of my life. And it also made me look at the world through the lens to understand that everyone is suffering. And that while certainly I was suffering, I should never forget that, because so often we judge people not by the events that are actually happening, but either how we've interpreted them or how we see something, and that's not truth. And we should be much more gentle, kinder, and accepting of people.
What a beautiful. I feel for you. I feel for that kid, really. And thank you for that woman. And thank you for, as the mother of famously Mr. Rogers said to him when he was a boy, thank you to all the helpers, looking for the helpers. Thank you for those who are helpful. Okay, thank you. Mamphela, 5-ish minutes, your own journey as a kid and things you had to deal with, and your own journey with compassion and toward compassion.
It's wonderful to be here with Jim, because mine is a completely different childhood. I'm a product of a village culture where Ubuntu, or compassion, was how we were brought up. We were brought up not to, our parents didn't say that's wrong or that's right. They said, this is how a person behaves, and that's not how a person behaves. So we were brought up in a village where every adult had a parenting responsibility. So there were reinforcements of our upbringing into people who will be fully whom we were created to be. That didn't mean that we were supposed to be uniform. The individuality of each child was respected within this collective and the solidarity that was at the heart of village life. I happen to be a granddaughter of a very successful small farmer who was an evangelist, and my parents were both teachers. So education for me was the way out of the limitations of village life. And I was the weakest, smallest in my family, and so I had to concentrate on what was between my ears. And my father, being a teacher, had very simple philosophy. He said, don't compete with other children being number one in the class. You must compete with yourself so that the best in you can manifest. And so I have been very fortunate to have mentors and teachers who really supported me, even after my father died when I was entering university in 1967. That was very traumatic, but I was held by people who saw the talent in me. And this is how I landed up at the University of Natal as a medical student. And for the first time, I saw the sea. I met with people who were speaking different languages. And this is how we got together as young people from very different backgrounds. But the common thing that brought us together was we were first time entering university students. And we all came from very poor backgrounds. And so what struck us was, how is it possible that a minority of a minority can hold a majority indigenous people to ransom in subjugation, in poverty for so long without these poor people or these majority people standing up? And this is how we got to focus on consciousness. Who are we? And what does it mean to be a human being? And we came to the conclusion that we are inherently wired to have dignity, self-respect, and respect for others who look like us. We are inherently wired for fairness and compassion. And when there is a fracture across those core values of what it means to be a human, then we are dysfunctional. And so we self-liberated from those constraints that were imposed by the apartheid government. And we were not anti-apartheid, we were for liberation. And so we became a small group of 15 students, poor, no experience in mobilization, but we learned as we went along because we were driven by the essence of what it means to be human. And that's how we started seeing the connection between how we're brought up and true freedom of the human spirit. And so we knew that the only way we can overcome the constraints of unfreedom was to band together, to coalesce as people who wanted freedom. And that's how the struggle for freedom in South Africa, which was moribund after Mandela was imprisoned and people went into exile, was revived because we were able not only to mobilize within the university where we were, but across the country and the high schools, the workers, even religious communities. So Desmond Tutu was conscientized by us, the great unwashed. So we stopped allowing anybody to call us non-white, non-European, because when you allow someone to define you in the negative, you are unfree.
Wow. And again, right there, thinking about your own personal story, and multiplying at times millions of people who were just brutally oppressed and had been for generations with all kinds of consequences. larger context. You spoke there eloquently about Ubuntu, which I'm learning more and more about, and you talked about our home base, if you will, and Africa, of course, is the home base of humanity. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about Ubuntu as a culture, and then I'll give you kind of a heads up here, Jim. I'm going to swing back to you and ask you about your own sense of the basic principles there and how you've tried to live them or struggled with living them in highly competitive, high, intensity, institutional settings, in a Western culture, which is probably where a lot of our listeners are sitting. So we'll get there. Okay, so a little bit about Ubuntu. What is it?
Well, if we take it from where I ended,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that we see the world today with multiple crises, climate, poverty, conflict, inequalities, and wars, what's the source of it? The source is that we have severed the ties between who we really are, which is we are human beings. We are a people who are supposed to show up every day with what's in our hearts, our minds, and our bodies, and there is no distance between the soul, the heart, the mind, and the body. And for as long as there is harmony between who we are, we are able to relate to the rest of the world to promote harmony with nature. We learn from Mother Nature, ever giving, ever generous. And we also learn to respect others and to respect their dignities and create environments which promote the best in all human beings. Now, the crises tell us we have stopped doing that. And what is the problem? The problem is that our ancestral wisdom has been thrown by the wayside, first by ancient European colonizers who had to find a way of living with dispossessing someone, living with disrespecting someone, because this was against who we are. And so you had to say that someone who looks darker than me, shorter hair, whatever, is not fully human. And so to be able to oppress, to colonize, to enslave, you have to dehumanize. Mm-hmm. So Ubuntu was there as a protector and is still there as a protector because you can lock down your conscience, but you can't kill it. And this is why the beauty of our movement for self-liberation and liberation of our country ended up also liberating those white people who thought they were superior. They were prisoners of a superiority complex, and we wanted everybody to enjoy freedom, including those who were prisoners of an inferiority complex. So Ubuntu is the connector, the glue that makes us whole as people.
Yeah, I've heard you describe it as, in a short phrase, I am because we are. And Jim, when I was reflecting on when I first met you, and I knew, and I could look back in retrospect, I didn't put it that way at the time. I knew at the time that you knew this, you are because we are, from the inside out. And also, you had risen to the highest levels in highly individualistic, Western culture saturated, American culture on steroids environments and elite academic medicine. You had risen to the highest levels, including also in startups and venture capital activities there in Silicon Valley, et cetera, nonetheless. And so I just kind of wondered if you could speak to your own journey of somehow bringing together and even maybe struggling to bring together kind of a deep knowing of what's true and how to be, and keeping your heart warm still in environments that could be really pretty cold.
No, thanks for putting that forward. I think one of the challenges for so many of us is that it's easy for us to believe in what others tell us. And what happens is then you lose your self-agency. And once you say, I cannot, by definition, it will not happen. And I think that's really, really quite important. And I was fortunate in that this woman was able to place this belief in me that anything was possible and that I could do it, and not to listen to the naysayers. And what's so sad for so many people is that there's so many people who are the first to tell them it's not possible, you're not good enough, etc. And oftentimes these are people who are closest to you. And so many people believe this. And the reality is we have unlimited power. We just need to see that within ourselves. And when someone unleashes that, that liberates you. And also, I think what you have to do is to make yourself be seen. And what I mean by that is so often with this baggage you may carry about who you think you are, it changes the energy that you carry around with yourself. And people respond to that for good or for bad. It's interesting, and I'll tell you a real quick story. When I applied to medical school, I had many difficulties before because I didn't have access or resources. I would have to leave college to get my father out of jail or to deal with my mother when she was in the hospital. And as a result, I missed many classes. I dropped many classes, and my grade point average was 2.52. And this was when I was to apply to medical school, where most of the listeners know that a GPA to get into medical school, even at that time, was 3.79. So by definition, I was not a candidate. But our school required us to have an interview before a pre-med committee, which was comprised of 3 professors. And I went in there and requested this appointment. And the secretary looked at my file and she said, I'm not giving you one. And I said, why? And she said to me, it's a waste of everyone's time. Now, what could be more hurtful for someone to basically be told you're worthless?
Yeah.
And
to still feel the weight of that today.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, I fortunately had the fortitude to say I would not leave until she gave me the appointment. And the point of this is she ultimately did. And I did meet with this committee, and there was an individual there who led the committee. And I'm sure many of you recall the pictures of Putin when he would sit at the table, and one person, he would be at one end and everyone else would be at the far end. And that's how I felt when I walked into this room. And this person took my file, threw it on the table, and he said, say what you have to say so we can get this over with. And, you know, those types of actions, that type of cruelty, that level of hurt, there's no place for it and there's no need for it. Now, I was fortunate in that I had a belief in myself, and I demanded that they see me, not my GPA. I refused to allow them to objectify me. And at the end of it, they were all crying, because if you force people to look at your humanity and not characterize you as a number or objectify you, they cannot hurt you.
Yeah.
So at the end of this, they were kind enough to give me the highest letter of recommendation, and it allowed me to go forward. And I applied to one school, and everything changed. And I didn't have any problems in medical school. But the point of the story is you can never predict what one person is capable of. And as a side note, the university I went to was at Tulane. After Hurricane Katrina, they lost their dean, and I actually endowed the dean's chair. And I rebuilt the library. I'm on the board of governors. And by all calculation, that should not have happened using the usual criteria that is used to choose applicants. So the point is, none of us can know what someone is capable of. And in fact, what is also true is that giving someone a chance, supporting someone, giving them words of affirmation can profoundly change someone's life. Because sometimes one person just needs somebody to believe in them.
That's beautiful. And I wonder, so you're at Stanford, and you've also been very involved in both nonprofit institutions like major universities, as well as in business. What have you seen, or what do you suggest is effective in getting these large organizations that have a lot of pressures on them that tend to promote hyper-individualistic, competitive, dog-eat-dog, scrambling to rise on the slippery pole kind of behaviors? What actually helps them to be more humane, pro-social, or to embody, even if they use other languaging for it, an Ubuntu kind of culture, even in their own organization? What have you seen helps there?
Well, it's certainly Ubuntu is extraordinarily powerful if that has been the gift you've been given since childhood. It makes you see the world a completely different way. Unfortunately, that is not the situation in the United States. We have this very individualistic society. And in fact, the sad thing is that, as an example, people from my background, they can choose one of two paths. The one path is to say, I've suffered. I don't want to see others suffer. But unfortunately, the other path is, I suffered and I'm not going to help anybody because nobody helped me. At least that's their perception. But none of us achieve anything without the help of tons of other people. We just may not appreciate it or know it. So I think that one thing is to walk the walk, and it's very hard to do that when people are attempting to attack you or to walk on top of you or to take advantage of you. And oftentimes compassion is perceived as being weak. Well, in fact, compassion and vulnerability are extraordinarily powerful tools. It's just you have to stand up and not allow yourself to be taken advantage of. And even that is demonstrating compassion, actually, instead of rolling over and doing what people who are innately unfair wish to do. Now, am I going to change everyone's mind? None of us will be able to do that. But I will assure you that there is every bit of evidence from a whole variety of research that demonstrates that when a corporate entity or an organization imbues this concept of compassion, it changes everything. And the reason it changes everything is because you cannot pay enough for a person to work who feels that they're appreciated, that they're involved in a mission that's bigger than themselves, that they have meaning, that they have purpose, because that is what gives one deep happiness. And also, it changes how they interact. When you appreciate someone's job, when you honor them and reward them appropriately, there's massive benefit. And there's, CEOs often talk about ROI, and they mistake the fact that they can increase production through fear. Well, that's very limiting. That's not sustainable. When you promote love, generosity, kindness, that increases your productivity, and it unleashes an amount of energy that is profound. And multiple studies have shown that when you integrate that into your organization, it changes everything. Just like when you integrate compassion as a meaningful aspect of your life. It has a huge positive physiologic effect, and it increases your longevity.
So, to build on that, then, for Mamphela, same kind of question. So, one thing that helps organizations, institutions act in more compassionate ways, both toward their employees and also out in the world, right, is to really understand the benefits, including bottom line, return on investment benefits, financially as well as others. That seems clear. I'm just curious, you've worked in lots of institutions at the world stage. What helps large organizations, whether it's a corporation or a non-governmental organization or nonprofit, what helps them to act in ways that are more compassionate, more pro-social, externally? In addition toward their own people, but externally toward the world at large, including from things from their carbon footprint to, their engagement in being an ally, to helping to make a better world. What helps nudge them in that better direction?
I think before we get into the specifics of that, I just want to bring us the larger reality to what Jim was talking about in his personal story.
Yeah.
Now, he was being discriminated against because of his socioeconomic status as a white male. Spare a thought for me, as a black woman in a country where I was less than just by being black, even more less than by being woman, and in a system where, for example, I told my pastor that I was going to medical school. He said, "How are you going to do that? My own daughter couldn't even become a doctor, so he's a nurse. And in any case, your father is dying. Who's going to pay for it?" Why? Because he had the permission to treat me as inferior simply because of being what I am. And this is the cancer which is across the globe. The failure to see a child like Jim with the circumstances he had comes out of the blunting of our humanity, particularly in your country with slavery and then racism and sexism. All of that come together to desensitize people from whom they are. My country today is free, and yet the elites who are now looking like me, they haven't changed much. And the reason is simple, that we pay too little attention to issues of the heart. We think that by simply having a constitutional democracy, we will be free. And so going back to the question of what makes people move in the direction of becoming more of whom we were created to become, I believe that it starts with traveling inside each one of us. So as a leader, when I became the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, again, I was told in my absence that I was going to ruin the university, because who the hell am I coming from a non-academic background? Now, the point is not to react to, because that person is wounded. So the first thing is to recognize that we are all wounded from the racism, the sexism, the insensitivity to people's life circumstances, and the inequities that we have normalized across the globe. When we are aware of that and we liberate ourselves, self-liberation is the greatest gift you can give to your family, your relationships, your institutions, and your country, and ultimately the world. But it takes many more of us to do it, which is the reason why I am a member of this Global Compassion Coalition. Because Alone, I have, for the last 53 years, been an activist in my own country, globally when I was at the World Bank. But the hard wiring that we have innately in us to be compassionate has been severed, has been traumatized by a system of socioeconomic development that makes having more important than being. And when having is the dominant theme, you have to compete for allegedly scarce resources. So Jim was a competitor to a scarce resource, which is entry into a medical school, not thinking about the abundance that by being a qualified doctor, he has been able to give back to humanity. So I think what we are called to is to understand that this is going to be a long journey, but like every long journey, it starts with the first step. The first step is how does each one of us show up in our homes so we can bring into this world and support the young people in our families and in our villages, in our communities, in our institutions to become the best that they can become. And they can then themselves become part of this chain, this collective, this coalition of compassion. And it works magic because I've worked with troubled children who have backgrounds like Jim was describing. And just a hug makes a lot of difference.
We actually had someone commenting in the chat about it would be very nice in Zoom if we could have a good, long, warm hug. Well, I think that question, by the way, of how do we get institutions and organizations to act more compassionately? How do we change their incentives, both in terms of how they treat their people and their immediate customers, and then how they treat the world altogether, is a fundamental question, because the difficult problem is how to increase individuals' level experiences and expressions of compassion. That's a real thing. The really difficult issue and challenge is to translate that increase in individual experiences and expressions of compassion to large-scale institutional behavior, as we all know. And so we're going to keep working on that challenge, including at the Global Compassion Coalition. I wanted to just then go back to you, Mamphela, and then bounce to you, Jim. Along your journey, you have faced adversaries, I'll call them that, people who stood in your way, people who harmed you directly, people, in the apartheid government police who murdered your partner, Steve Biko. How have you grappled with compassion with adversaries? And that's a question that many people are grappling with today, including political opponents and those who they say are really harming the world on the other side of one divide or another. What's been your own process of maintaining that? I think of compassion as a freedom of the heart, maintaining and finding that self-liberation of the heart, even for those who've wronged you and others terribly.
Very hard.
That's an honest
when you
answer.
have suffered the kind of loss I suffered, you feel, it's like the end of the world. And it is not the end of the world. You will wake up and therefore you have to deal with it. I had angels sent to me along my journey of self-liberating from the loss, the anger, the hurt. And these were complete strangers, Catholic priests in the area where I had been dumped as a terrorist. And this one priest used to sit at my bedside every day from morning until I fell asleep. And I can only put it to grace. And it is that grace that helped me over a number of months as I was waiting for, because at the time that Steve was killed, I was 4.5 months pregnant. And the idea of losing this baby who was threatening to miscarry was so horrific that I had to actually get myself to think beyond myself, to think about creating a safe space for this fetus. And these guardian angels helped me. And today he's 45 years old. But the point about it is, it wasn't just a one-day revelation of, let me give up. It's a journey. Because even after the first forgiveness, and then I landed up in Cape Town after 1984, I still had this terrible weight on my shoulders. Every September, I would go back to mourning until again another angel came to say, you actually have to let go. And it was hard. It took me 10 years to let go. But having done that, I'm the wounded healer who can really feel the hurt of somebody else. And therefore, adversaries I meet along the way, like when I was the vice chancellor and I was told that I will ruin the university, I feel sorry for that person. But that person had, you talk about incentives, that person was a very highly respected person. And instead of undermining him, I invited him to be one of the most powerful deans in this university. And he did well. So the incentives, you have to create incentives for people to go beyond their narrow-minded views of life. And by doing that, he became the best champion for the transformation of UCT. But also, the way the university worked was we rewarded those who went out of their way to support young Black students who were really in the wilderness as first time entering university. So I believe that leaders, whether they're in the public or the private sphere, have to think about the best way they can use the positions of power they have to create a better environment for each and everyone within the institution, whether it's a company or a government or the wider world. We do have it within ourselves. As you reminded me, Rick, we are because others are. There is no me without the we in humanity. And this beautiful human family we have is rich because of its diversity. So diversity is not a burden. It is a rich heritage.
Well, Jim, obviously you can feel free to speak to anything you like. I'm still really also interested in this question that's very alive for many people. Basically, compassion for those who are difficult for us, including those who are actively hurting us or harming others that we care about, grappling with that. So that said, feel free to speak to anything you like.
Well, I think the nature of life is that you're always going to meet people who are oppositional, regardless of the elevation of your work or the goal that you're striving for. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. And sadly, we see people in positions of power who can use that power in any way they wish. And certainly, I've been in that situation. And on the one hand, it's demoralizing. But on the other hand, I try not to get caught up in negative thoughts. I am saddened that certain people are ignorant or they don't understand who they really are or what the nature of our responsibilities in this world to the other. And as you pointed out, and Mamphela has pointed out, is that we're all one. And unfortunately, though, for a subset of people, until they can experience pain at a very deep level, that brings them back to reality. and then they're able to get a more clear perception of the truth of our humanity. I think what I try to do, although I'm not always successful, is to try to look at the other as myself. And if you are able to do that, you cannot do anything but act kind, hopefully. And also to appreciate that oftentimes when people are adversarial or disruptive, it's not even about the situation it's at hand. It's about other trauma that has afflicted them or baggage that they've carried that is driving their behaviors. And this is what's really horrible for so many people, because when you're in that situation, you don't understand oftentimes what the drivers of your behavior are. And it takes the ability to see that and understand it. But again, it's hard for people. I think the most important thing is to have emotion regulation. As you've heard that Viktor Frankl quote, which he didn't really say, but is attributed to him, which is you have stimulus and response. And many of us have that immediate, instantaneous response, which is driven by our sympathetic nervous system. And it doesn't always allow us to make the best decision. And so if you take a pause, and as he says, within that pause lies your freedom, it allows you to make much more thoughtful choices about how you react to people who are challenging. And that's been actually in many ways a lifesaver to me, in the sense that like all of us, I can be reactive, but when I force myself to always pause and just process what are the drivers here. And in fact, you talked about even competitive environments such as Stanford and others. This may be sort of a slightly different, but you never know what the subtext is sometimes behind why someone is doing some action. And in these hyper-competitive environments, unfortunately, there's a subset of people who are highly manipulative too, which is sort of the contrast to the drivers that are unconscious. There's a set of drivers that are conscious, but are motivating them to act a certain way, which is not the truth of why they're acting that way.
Yeah, so true. Well, kind of rounding it out here, moving, toward an end. A wonderful question has come in about how to bring this, the wisdom of compassion, into our schools and more broadly to young people. So I thought maybe I could start with you, Jim. C-care, the E at the end is education. You're very familiar with this process of bringing compassion into school settings and in general to people. What are some practical hows that you've seen that listeners to this program, as it were, participants in it, can take away themselves?
Well, first of all, I mean, the reality is that children model themselves on our own behavior. And so if you are not kind, if you're not compassionate, if you're not showing that example, kids intuit that. And oftentimes they therefore feel that there is no reason for them to be. Or if they see you being manipulative and taking advantage of people, they'll also integrate that. I think one of the things we can do is to, again, with teachers, before they can teach compassionate behavior, they have to understand to be self-compassionate. Unfortunately, especially in the United States, we have a huge number of underpaid individuals who are dealing with our most precious asset. And they are overwhelmed, they're besieged, and they have challenges in their own life because they're paid so little. So I think the most important thing is creating an environment where the teacher is cared for, because if they can't teach if they don't have the appropriate resources to support them. I think on the other side is there are many times these programs that are promulgated to help children, but it has to be in the context of understanding that, as an example, even at my son's school, where you have which is a fairly and one of the most affluent cities in the nation, there are several children who are homeless. The issue of food insecurity. Well, or violence or drugs. I mean, how can you expect a child to learn compassion or to be present if they're hungry or they're suffering from abuse or they're homeless? And so it's not as just simple as teaching a course. You have to, again, create an environment for human thriving. And so I think that it's not just trying to teach something, it's creating an environment that maximizes the ability to learn. And that environment that is created has to be based on compassion.
Thank you for that. And Mamphela, but before I go, I just think the statistic in America, you may know that already, Jim, is something like 1 million children a year are unhoused. They're homeless. 1 million children a year, and one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. So, Mamphela, how about you? Your thoughts about compassion, bringing it into schools, bringing it to younger people.
I come from a country and a continent which, although Ubuntu is still very much alive in the villages, but we are the most destructive when it comes to how we bring up children because of this drive to acquisition, to having rather than being. So the good example we have of bringing compassion into schools, which I would recommend for each one of us to practice in our own homes, which is a check-in. This school is called the LEAP school system. Every morning, the first period of every day is spent around tables because desks are the death of education. We need to throw away all the desks from all the schools everywhere in the world and change the classrooms into round tables, which is how our ancestors used to sit and have conversations of the heart, because it's the eyes that give you a window into how someone feels. And you can't see that if people are sitting behind you or far from you. And so this system works with the poorest children in homes where there is no food. You assume that they are coming to school hungry. So instead of just having little puzzles, they've institutionalized a meal. Somewhere after that first period, the kids have something, a proper breakfast, so that they are ready for the rest of the day. Now imagine if every corporation, every department in the public sector, every university were to start in smaller groups wherever they are, whether it's within a faculty office or within a classroom, checking in. Because then we connect and we unleash the full potential of everybody who feels heard, recognized, and if they have big issues, like it turns out with children living in circumstances like yours, Jim, the teacher can take the child away to have proper debrief so they can then follow up with the family to make sure that that child's home circumstances can be somehow modulated so they don't undo the work of trying to get this child to have the best possible education. So I believe that these, what we call Ubuntu circles, are essential tools for every institution to just take time once a day to check in. And it's better to do it at the beginning of the day. Then you go into the day energized and you are able to give the best of yourself. But also we need to realign the incentives. For as long as we pay teachers peanuts, we pay nurses so little, the very people at the heart of caring at the public level, we are undermining ourselves. And I think this calls for a total reimagination of what really matters in life. And COVID has taught us that the most important value is, or valuable thing to have, is life. And therefore, we need to reward the people who do the caring, the nurturing, and the development of people to be the best that they can become. We need to reward them appropriately.
So true. I've spent a lot of time in schools, and I think I come from a line of teachers as well. I think there's a special place in heaven for people who work in schools. Well, we're moving to an end, and I wanted, maybe starting with you, Jim, to give you each a minute or so. What are your hopes for the Global Compassion Coalition? Jim, you were absolutely right there at the foundation of it. The first glimmer of the beginning of this idea about a year and a half ago, it's really caught fire. Mamphela, you're the chair of our board now, so we'll get to you in a second. Jim, closing hopes and for the Global Compassion Coalition.
Well, I've used this analogy before, and I believe it's appropriate. In some ways, each of us is a drop in the ocean. But if we can see the possibility of those drops coalescing, and we create a tsunami of compassion that covers the world. Now, that may seem far-fetched, it may seem unrealistic, but our lives are based on aspirations. And I believe that if we do our job correctly, we will inspire people throughout the world to be their best selves. But it also means that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to be there. We have a responsibility to listen. And we have a responsibility to stand up and in some ways say enough is enough about certain aspects of our world, our politics, our culture that are hurting others and that are cruel and that are not compassionate. And if we know inside ourselves who we are, if we know that there's so many people who struggle, hopefully that will give each of us the strength to stand up and tell the world what is important, and that is recognizing the other as yourself.
That's great. Thank you. Mamphela, about the Global Compassion Coalition, your own hopes for it.
My hope is manifest. Wherever I've been, we've just come from Vancouver. Our role as the Global Compassion Coalition is to reawaken the Ubuntu in us, the human in each one of us. And when people hear that reawakening call, they respond very positively. They feel that they have let themselves down, and they feel that they can be part of something larger than themselves. I've seen it happen in my own country where, despite our failures over the last 30 years to live the Ubuntu which is in our constitution, when one speaks to groups of young people, unemployed, coming from horrible circumstances, their eyes lit up. And I see the Global Compassion Coalition as joining forces with an ever-growing spirit of reawakening that is there. And I kept giving Rick a number of correspondence with people who are trying to establish bigger coalitions to make sure that each one of us makes the largest impact where we are by showing up as the best we can be and by demonstrating to young people that they are as important, as lovable as anyone else. And so this is the mission of the Global Compassion Coalition. And I'm very excited about the opportunity to walk this journey with people like Jim and Rick and many others. And this is how the world should be reimagined and rebuilt.
That's beautiful. Thank you. The more people we are, the stronger we are. Currently, the coalition has about 40,000 members, which is growing several thousand a week. We really invite your participation. I know many more people registered for this event and will see the recording and are here live, and many others will be able to see it over time. We welcome your support. We welcome you to join. We welcome your donations. Every little bit helps. Big bits help a lot. And I want to also just simply finish by thanking my two friends and guests here, Jim and Mamphela, and thank you all who have participated in this together. It really is a kind of coming together, as both Jim and Mamphela have said so well. It is through this coming together that we can make the world that we know in our hearts can be. But we just have to find the strength that is rooted only in our own history of truly coming together for the common good, the good of all of us, not just the few. So thank you. Tons and tons of thanks, many, many thanks. And I'm going to wrap it up here. I think I'm going to close the meeting, so we'll see each other later this evening in a different situation, Jim and Mamphela. So thank you all. I'm going to count it down and close this meeting. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you.